Gideon Vale didn't even let her finish knocking. The gate to Iron Creek Ranch swung open maybe 2 feet, and he filled the gap like a wall big shoulders, a jaw that hadn't softened in 40 years, and eyes that ran over Evelyn Hartwell and her 3 children the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. "You're the one who answered the cook notice," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn said yes. He laughed. Not the kind of laugh that carries any warmth. The kind that's meant to land like a slap. "Lady, look at yourself." He gestured at the children, at her worn coat, at the thin carpet bag she'd carried 12 miles through frozen ground. "You walked out here with 3 kids hanging off you, and you think you're going to feed 30 ranch hands? You can't even feed yourself." Her youngest, Clara, was 7 years old and had been holding Evelyn's hand the entire walk. At those words, the little girl's fingers tightened, and then went very still. That stillness was the thing that changed everything. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the humiliation of being laughed at in front of strangers on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. It was her daughter's hand going quiet inside her own. Evelyn Hartwell had survived worse than Gideon Vale, but she had never before watched one of her children understand in real time that the world intended to treat them as nothing. She did not leave. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, you knew you needed to stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The walk to Black Hollow had taken most of the morning. Evelyn had started before first light, when the ground was still locked in the kind of cold that makes your boots sound hollow against the earth. She'd bundled the children in every layer she owned that wasn't already on her own body. Her older son, Thomas, 11 years old, and trying hard not to show that his feet hurt, wore her late husband's scarf wrapped twice around his neck. Margaret, 9, had Evelyn's spare wool socks pulled over her own, and didn't complain about them bunching at the toe. Clara got the coat lining Evelyn had cut out and sewn into a rough vest 2 nights ago by lamplight, stitching until her fingers cramped. She had done the math. She had no choice but to do it. The money from selling the mule was nearly gone. The landlord of the 2-room house they'd been renting in town had given her until the end of the month, which was 11 days away. She had enough flour for 4 more days of meals if she was careful, and she intended to be careful, but careful only stretched so far. The job notice had been tacked to the post outside the general store. Iron Creek Ranch cook needed. Experience required. Apply in person. She'd read it 3 times standing in the cold. She had experience. 12 years of cooking for a household, 6 of them feeding hired hands, when her husband's small farm had been something worth working. She knew how to stretch a supply order, how to plan a week of meals from what most people would consider the leavings of a week. She knew how to keep a fire at the right temperature for bread in a drafty kitchen, and how to smoke meat when you didn't have a proper smokehouse, and how to tell if flour had turned before you wasted good fat on it. What she didn't have was a letter of reference, because the man who might have written one was buried on a hill outside of Clarksville, and his name on a piece of paper wasn't going to get her children through winter anyway. She took the notice off the post. The walk to Iron Creek was 12 miles, and she knew it, and she packed accordingly. Biscuits wrapped in cloth for the children, a small canteen of water, nothing for herself. She would eat when there was something worth eating. She'd learned that habit years ago and hadn't unlearned it. Thomas had walked without speaking for the first 3 miles, which she appreciated. He was at the age where he understood more than she wanted him to, and said less than she feared he would. Margaret had talked enough for both of them, narrating the frozen landscape with the relentless curiosity of a child who found the world interesting, even when it was actively trying to discourage that feeling. Clara had held Evelyn's hand and watched everything with the serious dark eyes she'd inherited from her father. By mile 8, Thomas's jaw had gone tight, in a way Evelyn recognized. By mile 10, Margaret had stopped narrating. By mile 11, all 3 of them were quiet, and that quiet was its own kind of weight. She hadn't told them there was a chance this wouldn't work. She hadn't told them what happened if it didn't. She'd said, "We're going to see about a job, and if we do good work and show what we're made of, things are going to get better." She believed that. She had to believe it, because the alternative was a kind of darkness she couldn't afford to look at directly. The gate to Iron Creek appeared at the end of a long, flat stretch of frozen road, 2 wooden posts, and an iron arch with the ranch name worked into the metal. It looked like something that had been built with money and intention, even if the intention was a long time ago now. She knocked. Gideon Vale opened the gate, and then he laughed at her. She stood there after the laugh died, and she felt the cold in a different way than she had for the last 12 miles. It wasn't the temperature. It was something that moved through her chest and settled low, that old familiar feeling of being looked at and found insufficient before a single word of real substance had been exchanged. She had felt it before. She'd felt it at the bank when she tried to discuss the mortgage after Daniel died, and the man behind the desk had looked at her like she'd wandered in from the wrong room. She'd felt it at the general store when the owner started explaining things to her slowly, like she was a child, like the fact of her widowhood had somehow also taken her intelligence. She'd felt it in a dozen small moments in the 18 months since Daniel's passing, this low-grade dismissal that was the particular inheritance of a woman alone in a world that had decided, without consulting her, that alone meant diminished. She had gotten used to it, in the way you get used to an old injury. You learn to walk around it. You learn to let it pass through you without letting it take up permanent residence. But Clara's hand going still, that was the thing she couldn't let pass through her and leave nothing behind. She started. Vale, he said. Gideon Vale. Foreman. And before you say whatever you're about to say, I'll save you the walk back. We need a cook, not a nursery. Then you need me, Evelyn said. He blinked. It was a small thing, that blink, but she caught it. I've been running a kitchen since I was 16 years old, she said. I know how to feed men who work hard for long hours and come in hungry enough to eat the table if you're not ready for them. I know how to plan supply and manage waste and keep a fire through the night. My children are not a liability. They've worked alongside me since they could stand. She paused. I'd like to speak with the owner. Vale's expression shifted into something colder. The owner doesn't take meetings with every woman who shows up at the gate. Is he on the property? A beat of silence. He's busy. I'll wait, Evelyn said. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Not loudly, not with particular heat, but with the kind of finality that doesn't leave much room for negotiation. She stepped back from the gate and found a flat section of fence post to lean against and folded her hands in front of her. Vale stared at her. She met his gaze without blinking. Thomas to her left had straightened up. She noticed it in her peripheral vision, her 11-year-old son standing a little taller, trying to take his cue from her. Vale made a sound that wasn't quite a word, turned and walked back toward the main buildings. He left the gate open, which she decided to interpret as an invitation. The yard of Iron Creek Ranch told a story she was already familiar with, from this place specifically, but from the general shape of things in decline. The fence rails on the east side of the yard needed replacement. There were 2 wagons sitting at odd angles that suggested they hadn't been moved recently. The main house looked solid, built from good timber, but the porch overhang had a sag to the left corner that nobody had gotten around to addressing. There was horse tack hung over a corral rail that should have been stored inside. These weren't catastrophic signs, but they were the signs of a place running with too few hands and too little attention to spare, where the urgent kept pushing out the necessary. She'd managed that kind of household before. It looked different when you were on the inside of it, when it was yours to solve rather than observe. Clara was watching a spotted dog that was watching them from 20 feet away with cautious interest. Margaret had found a loose stone near the gatepost and was examining it with the intensity she applied to everything. Thomas was looking at the outbuildings. Don't touch anything, Evelyn said quietly. Don't wander. Stay where I can see you. Mama Thomas said, Is this going to work? She looked at him. He had his father's coloring and his father's way of asking a hard question like it was a simple one. I don't know yet, she said, but we're not leaving until I find out. He nodded. That was enough for him. She was grateful, not for the first time, that she'd raised a child who could handle an honest answer. The man who came out of the main house wasn't what she expected. She'd been building a picture of the owner in her head during the wait-some version of Vale, perhaps, or the bankmen she'd dealt with, something polished and dismissive. What came through the door was a man in his mid-40s who looked like he hadn't slept well in several months, with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from a single bad night, but from accumulation. He was tall, and he might have been imposing once, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that was purely exhausted. He looked at her, then at the children, then back at her. You're the woman who wants the cook position, he said. Yes, she said. Evelyn Hartwell. Nathaniel Cross. He didn't extend his hand, but he wasn't unfriendly about it. He was just a man who had too much on his mind to remember the courtesies. She understood that. Gideon tells me you walked here from town. I did, with 3 children. I did. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Thomas, who held the look without flinching. He looked at Margaret, who smiled at him with the unself-conscious confidence of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned that strangers weren't automatically trustworthy. He looked at Clara, who was still watching the dog. "How old are they?" he asked. 11, 9, and 7. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate you coming out, but what Gideon said, we're in a rough stretch here. The men I've got left are not easy company. It's not a situation suited to cooked for rough men," she said. "My husband ran a working farm. Before that, my father ran a logging camp, and I helped my mother run the kitchen. I'm not looking for suited. I'm looking for work." He looked at her for a longer moment than she expected. She let him look. She didn't fill the silence. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. Blunt question, she answered it bluntly. "He died 16 months ago. Fever. We lost the farm 6 months after that. Couldn't keep up the mortgage without his income. I've been managing in town since then, but town work dried up and I need something steady." She paused. "Mr. Cross, I am not asking you to take a risk on charity. I am asking you to take a risk on work. If I can't prove my worth in 2 weeks, you can tell me to go. But I think if you let me into that kitchen, you'll find reasons to keep me." Another silence. Vale was standing off to the side with his arms crossed. She could feel his disapproval from where she stood. Cross looked at the main house, then at the yard, then at something she couldn't see, some internal accounting she wasn't privy to. 2 weeks, he said finally. "I'll give you the room off the kitchen. It's small, but it's something. The children sleep there with you. You feed the crew 3 times a day and keep the kitchen in order. The men are satisfied. We talk about something longer term." "That's fair," she said. "Gideon will show you the kitchen." He went back inside. Vale watched him go with an expression that had several layers to it, none of them friendly. Then he turned to Evelyn and jerked his head toward the far side of the yard. "Come on then," he said. "Don't get comfortable." Kitchen was worse than she'd expected. She'd expected bad. She'd steeled herself for bad during the walk from the gate. But the kitchen at Iron Creek Ranch was the particular kind of bad that comes from being abandoned rather than simply neglected. There's a difference, and she felt it immediately. Neglect means nobody cleaned, nobody organized. Things got shuffled around and left wrong. Abandonment means the person who knew where everything was and why it mattered just stopped coming in one day, and everything they'd understood about the space left with them. Stove was functional. She could see that much. But it needed cleaning, and the flue pipe had a gap in the joint that would need to be sealed, or it would steal half the heat from every fire she built. The work table was solid, good wood, but there was a layer of grime on the surface that was going to take real work to get through. Ply shelves had gaps in them like missing teeth salt. Yes, and some dried beans, and some flour that she'd need to check for quality. But she could see immediately that whoever had been doing the ordering had either left or stopped paying attention. There were good things. A solid root cellar door in the floor that she'd check later. Several cast iron pans hanging on wall hooks, heavier than they needed to be, but that meant they were quality. A full wood stack against the back wall that someone had at least maintained. Clara had found a corner and was sitting in it, watching everything. Margaret was already opening cabinets with the investigative thoroughness she applied to any new environment. Thomas was standing near the window, looking out at the yard. Vale stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Previous cook quit 2 weeks ago," he said. "Before that, the one before her quit. Men have been fending for themselves since. They're not happy. I wouldn't expect them to be," Evelyn said. She was moving through the space, running a hand along the shelf edges, checking the grain of the flour by smell, pressing her thumb against the wood of the work table. "You understand what I'm saying?" Vale's voice had shifted into something with a warning underneath it. Unhappy ranch hands are not patient men. They're not going to make allowances. You get in here and start producing something that resembles a proper meal, or they're going to make your life very difficult, and I am not going to spend my time managing their attitude towards you. "I didn't ask you to," she said. He stared at her back. 2 weeks, he said. $60 if you last that long. Turned around. "What did the previous cook earn?" Paused. Just long enough to be telling. $60, he said. "What did the one before that earn?" Another pause. "That's not your take." 60, she said. She turned back to the shelves. "But I want a full accounting of the current supply inventory, and I want the authority to submit a revised supply order by the end of the week. If I'm going to feed this crew properly, I need to know what I'm working with, and I need to be able to fix what's missing." "You don't have the authority." "Then ask Mr. Cross if I do," she said. "Because if I don't, I can't do the job the way it needs doing, and then we're all wasting each other's time." A long silence. She heard Vale's boots on the floor as he turned and walked away without another word. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her from the window with wide eyes. "All right," she said, "we have work to do." The first meal was dinner, and she had 3 hours. She'd done a full survey of the supply shelf and the root cellar in the first 40 minutes, moving quickly with Margaret, helping her call out quantities, and Thomas writing them down on a scrap of paper he'd found. Clara had taken it upon herself to locate every pot and pan in the kitchen and arrange them by size, which was not something Evelyn had asked for, but turned out to be useful. What she had: 2 sacks of dried beans, 1 partial, 1 nearly full, enough flour for bread if she was careful, salt pork in the root cellar, more than she expected, which meant someone had been ordering that right, even while letting other things go, 3 onions, a handful of dried herbs that smelled like they'd been there a while but were still usable, lard, cornmeal. What she didn't have: fresh vegetables of any kind, enough eggs for a real breakfast, coffee that wasn't half exhausted, and anything resembling a plan for the week. She started with what she had. The beans went into water to begin their soak for tomorrow. You couldn't rush beans, but you could plan for them. The salt pork came out of the cellar, and she trimmed it and started rendering the fat in the largest of the cast iron pans, letting the smell of it fill the kitchen. She mixed cornbread batter from the cornmeal and the last of the good lard and got it into the Dutch oven. She sliced the onions and let them cook down in the rendered fat until they were soft and brown and smelled like something you'd be grateful for at the end of a hard day. It wasn't fancy. It was salt pork and beans starting, cornbread, and fried onions over everything, with the last of the flour going into a gravy. But it was hot, it was real, and it smelled like someone had actually put thought into it. The first man through the door was a ranch hand named Pete, short and weathered with a mustache that needed attention, who stopped in the doorway and visibly breathed in before he caught himself. He sat down without saying anything. The others came in behind him, 7 of them, down from what she understood had been 15 at the ranch's working peak, and they were all exhausted and hungry and wary of her, in the way you get wary of something new when the new things in your life have mostly been disappointing. She served them without ceremony, filled the plates the same way, no favorites, no shortcuts. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Pete looked up from his plate. "Who made the gravy?" "I did," Evelyn said. He looked at it, looked at her, nodded once and went back to eating. That was the whole of it. But she'd been around working men long enough to know what that nod meant. It meant, all right, it meant you can be here. It meant, let's see what tomorrow is. From the doorway, she could see Gideon Vale watching. His expression gave nothing away. She cleared the plates and started planning tomorrow. The room off the kitchen was exactly as small as Cross had said. There was a narrow cot against one wall and floor space for 2 more if you arranged carefully, and Evelyn had learned to arrange carefully. Thomas and Margaret shared the cot. Thomas at one end, Margaret at the other, with their feet in each other's faces and a negotiated arrangement about whose feet were colder that they'd worked out before they'd finished unpacking. Clara slept tucked against Evelyn on a blanket on the floor. It was tight and it was cold around the edges, and the ceiling had a low spot near the corner that made Thomas have to duck, which he found insulting in the specific way that 11-year-olds find things insulting. But it was a roof, it was indoors. It was more than they'd had reason to expect 3 days ago. Evelyn lay in the dark after the children were asleep and ran the numbers in her head. Supply inventory. What she needed versus what she had. The distance to the nearest farm where she might arrange a supplemental purchase. State of the stove flue. She'd need rags and paste to seal it. And she'd need to do it tomorrow before the morning fire, or she'd lose too much heat. Flour situation was closer to critical than she'd let on to anyone. If the supply order didn't go through by midweek, she'd need to figure something out from what she had. She thought about Gideon Vale in the doorway. She thought about the nod from Pete. She thought about Clara's hand going still. She was not going to let this fail. By the 4th day, she'd gotten the supply order approved. Not without a fight. Vale had gone through every line of it with the specific hostility of a man looking for reasons to say no and finding them insufficient. Questioned the amount of coffee she'd requested. Too much, he said. She explained, without raising her voice, that undercaffeinated men made more mistakes and cost the ranch more than coffee did. He'd questioned the eggs. She told him to calculate the cost per meal of eggs versus the cost per meal of salt pork, and then to get back to her. He'd questioned the dried fruit. She didn't bother justifying the dried fruit. She just held his gaze until he moved on. Cross had been present for the last part of this exchange. He hadn't interfered. He'd stood slightly to the side with his coffee cup and listened, and at the end he'd told Vale to put the order through. Vale had looked at Evelyn with something that wasn't quite hate. It was too practical for hate, and then he'd walked out. "He's not a bad man," Cross said after he left. He said it without particular conviction, like a habit he'd had so long he'd forgotten to question it. "He's afraid," Evelyn said. Cross looked at her. "He's been managing this ranch through a hard stretch," she said. "He's been watching things fall apart, and he hasn't been able to stop it. And now there's someone in the kitchen who might actually fix something, and he doesn't know what to do with that. Men like him, they don't mind struggling as long as they're the ones in charge of the struggling." Cross was quiet for a long moment. "Where'd you learn to read people like that?" he asked. "My father's logging camp," she said. In a 12-year marriage, she picked up the dish she'd been drying. "In the last 16 months. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then decided against it, and he left, and she went back to work. By the end of the first week, 3 things had changed. First, the men had stopped eating as fast. When you're eating food that's only fuel, you eat to get it done. When you're eating something that's actually good, you slow down without meaning to, and they'd started slowing down. Pete had started arriving 5 minutes early, ostensibly to refill his coffee, but actually, she suspected, because he liked the smell of the kitchen in the mornings. A younger hand named Calhoun, who couldn't have been more than 20, and was clearly homesick in that particular way of young men who don't know how to say they're homesick, had started lingering after meals to help wash up without being asked. Second, Thomas had found a use for himself. He'd started helping with the heavy carrying without being asked, supplies from the delivery, wood from the stack, buckets of water from the well. He'd introduced himself to Pete with a formality that had made the older man blink and then grin, and by the third day Pete was explaining something about horse tack to him, while they both pretended it was casual. Third, Gideon Vale had gotten quieter. Not friendlier, she wasn't confused about that, but quieter. He watched. He was waiting for something to go wrong, and she could feel that waiting like a low-level pressure, but as long as nothing went wrong, all he could do was wait. On the 7th night, she sat on the edge of the kitchen, step in the cold dark, after the children were asleep, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, a particular brand of exhaustion that comes from holding everything together by force of will. Not physical exhaustion, though that was there too. Her feet ached constantly now, and her hands had new calluses in new places from the heavier pans and the longer hours. It was the other kind, the kind that lives in your chest and asks you, "How long can you keep this up?" She didn't know the answer. She only knew that she was going to keep going until she found out. Inside, Clara made a small sound in her sleep and then went quiet. Evelyn sat in the dark a moment longer. Then she went inside and started planning breakfast. The morning of the 8th day started with a broken flue pipe. Not the joint she'd already sealed with rags and paste, a different section, higher up, where the pipe met the ceiling fitting. She discovered it when she lit the morning fire at 4:30, and the smoke didn't draw right, coming back into the kitchen in slow gray curls instead of pulling up and out the way it should. She stood there in the dark, with her eyes watering, and figured it out in about 9 seconds, and then she did what she always did when something broke. She found a way around it. She cooked the morning meal on a lower fire than she wanted, which meant the biscuits took longer, and the bacon went slower, but she kept the door and the single window cracked to manage the smoke, and she had everything on the table by the time the men started coming in at 6. Nobody noticed anything wrong. The food was hot. The coffee was strong. Pete arrived at his usual 5 minutes early and refilled his cup and sat down without comment. After breakfast, she went to find Cross. He was in the barn, which was where he went most mornings. She'd learned his patterns in the patterns of anyone you're living in close proximity to, not deliberately but by accumulation. He was checking the front left leg of a gray horse with a methodical patience that suggested this was not the first time and probably not the last. "Flue pipe in the kitchen needs to be replaced," she said. "The upper section. I can manage around it for a few days, but if it's not fixed by the end of the week, I'll lose heat on the morning fires, and the bread won't rise right." He looked up at her, then back at the leg. "I'll have Calhoun look at it. It needs someone who knows pipe fitting. Calhoun is willing, but he's not experienced with it." Pause. "I'll find someone. There's also the matter of the east fence rail on the far side of the yard. I'm not trying to involve myself in ranch business that isn't my concern, but I walked past it this morning, and 2 of the rails are cracked through. If a horse gets into that gap, Mrs. Hartwell." He said it without sharpness, just the weight of a man with too many things already in his head. "I know about the fence. She stopped. He straightened up from the horse's leg. He looked tired in that deep way that had nothing to do with last night's sleep. I know about the fence, and I know about the pipe, and I know about the wagon wheel that's been sitting wrong for 3 weeks. I know about all of it. I just don't always have the hands to address everything at once. She stood there in the barn doorway with the cold morning behind her, and she looked at him, really looked at him the way she sometimes looked at the supply shelves, taking stock of what was actually there rather than what she hoped to find. How many men did you have before? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. 15, at the height of it. And now you have 7, 8, with Calhoun's cousin coming on next week. If he comes. He said he'd come. Why did they leave? He was quiet again longer this time. Some of it was money, he said. Bad season, 2 years ago. I couldn't pay what I'd promised, and some of them went somewhere that could. Some of it was he stopped. Started again. When a place feels like it's going under, men can smell it. Horses smell water. They start looking for higher ground before the flood actually comes. She understood that. She'd felt it herself. Not about this place, but about the farm after Daniel died. That specific quality of an ending that the walls themselves seem to absorb. So that being inside feels like being inside something that's already over. Kitchen helps, she said. It wasn't a boast. It was just an observation. The same way she'd observed that sealing the flue joint had kept more heat in the room. He looked at her. I know it does. Men who eat well work better. It's not complicated, but it's also not sufficient by itself. She hesitated, because she was aware that she was moving into territory that wasn't strictly her business, and she'd learned that moving carefully in unfamiliar territory was the difference between being useful and being presumptuous. If you want to talk through the other problems, sometime, the operational ones, I'm willing to listen. I've managed a household through bad seasons. Some of what I learned might apply. He looked at her for a long moment. You're a cook, he said. I'm a cook, she agreed. And a widow and a mother of 3, and someone who kept a farm running for 6 months after my husband died with no help and no clear idea of how to do it. I figured a lot of things out in those 6 months that I didn't know I was capable of figuring out. She paused. So yes, I'm a cook, among other things. The gray horse shifted its weight and bumped cross with its nose, seeking attention. He reached up and rubbed the animal's jaw without looking, the automatic gesture of a man accustomed to animals. I'll get the pipe fixed, he said. She nodded and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard him say something quiet to the horse. She didn't catch the words. It wasn't meant for her. 10th day brought Margaret's disaster. It wasn't her fault, or at least it wasn't entirely her fault, which was the more accurate thing to say about most disasters. Margaret had been helping with the morning washing up something she'd taken on herself without being asked. The way Margaret approached most things, with the assumption that her help was self-evidently welcome, and she'd been carrying a stack of tin plates from the wash basin to the shelf when she caught her foot on the uneven board near the stove and went down. Plates went everywhere. The noise was catastrophic in the small space. Margaret sat on the floor in the wreckage of scattered tin and looked up at her mother with an expression that was working very hard not to collapse into tears. Evelyn crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, took stock of the situation. No broken plates. These were tin and didn't break, and more importantly, no broken Margaret, and crouched down to her daughter's level. Anything hurt? She asked. No, Margaret said, with the specific tone of someone who is moderately hurt, but has decided not to admit it. Let me see your knee. The knee was scraped, but not serious. Evelyn pressed her hand briefly to her daughter's head, then stood and started picking up plates. Help me with these, she said. Margaret got up. She was limping slightly, but she started collecting plates without being asked twice. They'd gotten most of them stacked when Gideon Vale appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd clearly heard the crash from across the yard. She could tell from the speed with which he'd arrived, though he was trying to look like he'd just been passing. He looked at the situation, at Margaret, at the scattered plates, mostly collected now. This is what I'm talking about, he said. Evelyn kept stacking plates. I beg your pardon? Children in a working kitchen. He stepped inside without being invited. This is exactly what I told Cross would happen. You can't run a professional kitchen with. 1 plate didn't fall, Evelyn said. My daughter slipped on a loose board. The board has needed fixing for 2 weeks, and I've mentioned it twice. She set the stack on the shelf and turned to face him. If you'd like to address the actual cause of the problem, I'd appreciate you getting that board nailed down before the end of the day. His jaw tightened. That's not. Otherwise, she continued. I'll put a piece of scrap wood over it myself. and it won't look nice, but it'll work. And then we can have a separate conversation about what constitutes a kitchen problem and what constitutes a maintenance problem. Margaret, standing slightly behind her mother, was very still. Vale looked at Evelyn, then at Margaret. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. It wasn't softening exactly, but it wasn't the same thing that was usually there either. "I'll have the board fixed," he said. He left. Margaret exhaled. "Mama," she whispered, "does he hate us?" Evelyn considered this. Deserved a real answer. "He's scared of what happens if things change," she said. "Men like that, when they're scared, they get mean. It's not personal. It's just what they know how to do." Margaret thought about this. "That's sad," she said. "It is," Evelyn said. "Now help me with the breakfast pots." Board was fixed by noon. By the end of the second week, the invisible thing had happened, the thing Evelyn had been working toward without being able to name it directly, because naming it felt like tempting fate. The crew had stopped being individuals who happened to share a dinner table and had started being something with a collective character. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when it happened. These things don't arrive at a specific moment. They accumulate, the way snow accumulates, without any single flake being the one that makes the difference. Part of the food, the fact that there was real food, planned food, food that anticipated what a man's body needed after a specific kind of workday, rather than just food that was technically edible. It was partly the kitchen itself, which Evelyn had gotten clean and organized and warm, so that coming in from the cold and the work felt like arriving somewhere, rather than just stopping. But it was also the smaller things. Pete had started asking Thomas about his reading, after discovering the boy had a worn copy of a history book he'd been carrying since they left town. He'd admitted, with some reluctance, that he'd never learned properly himself, and Thomas had started reading to him in the evenings after dinner, both of them at the corner of the kitchen table, with the book between them. Pete's expression cycling between concentration and something that was trying not to be moved. Calhoun had fixed the flue pipe, and in the process of fixing it, he and Evelyn had spent an hour in a pragmatic back and forth about the kitchen's ventilation problems generally, and at the end of it he'd said quietly that she reminded him of his mother, and then looked immediately mortified at having said it, and she'd told him that was a fine thing to be reminded of, and left it there. A man named Driscoll, who was the most taciturn of all of them, who'd eaten 14 meals in the kitchen without saying a word beyond the occasional grunt that meant "pass the salt" had arrived one morning, with a collection of wild herbs bundled in his jacket. He set them on the work table without explanation. She'd identified them, said thank you, and used them in the noon meal. He'd eaten with an expression that was still mostly closed, but had something satisfied tucked underneath it. These weren't large things. But large things are built out of small things, and she knew that. What she also knew, because she'd been watching it build, was that Gideon Vale was getting restless. He'd been quiet since the plate incident, not friendlier, but quieter, and she'd learned enough about the texture of his moods to understand that quiet from him meant he was gathering something. He watched the kitchen with the particular attention of a man building a case. He watched Cross. He watched the way Cross had started arriving at the kitchen door after the evening meal more often. Not always with a clear purpose, but with the quality of someone who found the place easier to be in than other places. She noticed this. She didn't address it directly. She fed the crew and planned the next day, and managed the supply order and kept the children on the right side of the line between present and intrusive. And she watched the way things were shifting, without letting herself believe the shift was permanent. Not yet. It was a Tuesday, she remembered, because Tuesdays were when Calhoun's cousin was supposed to have arrived and hadn't. And Cross had been in a tight-jawed mood all morning about it when Vale made his move. She was in the kitchen after the noon meal, working through the weekly supply accounting, when she heard voices from the direction of the main house. Not loud enough to make out words, but the quality of the exchange was wrong. Not conversational, more pressured, the rhythm of someone making a point and someone else fielding it. Kept working. 20 minutes later, Cross appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his hat in his hand, which she'd noticed he did when he was uncomfortable. "Gideon tells me there's been talk in town," he said. She set down her pencil. About you. About your being here." He looked at the hat. "About what it looks like. A widow woman living on a working ranch with a crew of men." She kept her voice level. "What exactly is the concern?" "Gideon says people are talking. Says it's not decent. That it reflects poorly on the operation. That some of the local businessmen he's spoken to have noted it." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Cross," she said, Have I given anyone here cause for concern about my conduct? No. Has the work been done? Yes. Have the men been fed and the ranch run more smoothly in the past 2 weeks than it was before I arrived? He was quiet. Gideon says yes, he admitted. What specifically is the problem? She kept her tone even, not cold, not hot. Factual, because what I'm hearing is that I'm doing good work, and someone is worried about what it looks like. And I would ask you to consider who benefits from me leaving, and whether that person's concern is really about decency or about something else. Cross looked at her, really looked at her. He put his hat back on. I'll talk to Gideon, he said. She picked up her pencil. She waited until he was gone before she let out a slow breath. What Cross said to Vale, she never knew directly. The day after that conversation, Vale was different in a specific way. Not beaten exactly. More like a man who'd been told to stand down and knew he had to comply while still not agreeing with the order. He did his work. He managed the crew. He stopped making appearances in the kitchen doorway for the sole purpose of finding fault. He also, she noticed, stopped eating in the kitchen. 3 days he took his meals wherever he was. She didn't ask, and nobody volunteered the information. On the 4th day he appeared at the table again, sat at the end furthest from her and ate in silence. She served him the same plate she served everyone else. He ate it without comment. That was, she decided, as close to a ceasefire as she was likely to get, and she'd take it. The moment that changed the texture of everything. Not the direction. The texture happened on a Thursday evening near the end of the 3rd week. Evelyn had been up since 4 in the morning and had worked through without stopping except for the children's meals and a brief 20 minutes at midday when she sat on the kitchen step and ate a biscuit and allowed herself to not be moving. By evening she was running on something that wasn't quite energy anymore, just the forward momentum of habit and necessity. She was finishing the evening dishes when she heard a sound from the common room. Music. Someone had a mouth harp. She'd known there was one in the bunkhouse because Calhoun had mentioned it. But this was coming from the common room of the main house, and the player was not polished exactly, but not uncertain. The kind of playing that means a person has been doing it a long time in private and has opinions about how it should be done. She dried her hands. She went to the doorway between the kitchen and the common room. Cross was sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace with the mouth harp, not playing for anyone, just playing, the way people do when they've forgotten for a minute that they're being observed. He caught her in his peripheral vision and stopped. I didn't know you played, she said. I don't, usually. He turned the harp over in his hands. My wife did. I picked it up from her. Never got as good. She'd known there had been a wife. She'd gathered it from small things. The way the house had certain details that weren't the choices of a man living alone. Curtains in a pattern someone had cared about. A quilt on the chair by the window with a particular kind of careful stitching. She hadn't asked, because some things you don't ask directly. How long ago, she said. 4 years. He looked at the harp. She was the one who kept this place what it was. After she went, it started. He made a gesture with his hand that meant everything he wasn't saying. Can't just take the person out and keep everything else the same. It doesn't work that way. No, Evelyn said, it doesn't. He looked up at her. Your husband. How did you manage, after? It was the first time he'd asked her something that wasn't about the ranch. She leaned against the doorframe. Badly, she said. For the first 2 months I managed badly. I made bad decisions, and I was too proud to ask for help, and I burned a pot of beans I'd been counting on because I forgot about them. I cried over the beans more than I cried at the funeral, which I think says something about where I was. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity. Something more like recognition. Then I got up, she said, not because I had some great understanding of things, just because the children needed breakfast, and there wasn't anyone else to make it. She paused. It was the most useful fact I've ever been given. They needed breakfast, so I made breakfast. And then the next day I made breakfast again. Quiet for a moment. That's it, he said. That's all of it, she said. I don't think there's more to it than that. You find the thing that has to be done and you do it. And the next day you find another thing. And eventually you look up and the worst of it is behind you and you're still standing. He turned the mouth harp over in his hands one more time, then set it on the side table. Ply order for next month, he said, which was his way of returning to solid ground. You mentioned you wanted to talk about it. She straightened up from the doorframe. I do. The bean situation is workable, but I want to talk about supplementing from the Henderson farm to the west. They have winter storage they're looking to trade. Can arrange something that works for both sides. He nodded. Come by tomorrow morning, after the crew's breakfast. She said she would. She went back to the kitchen and finished the dishes in the quiet. The Henderson farm arrangement was her idea, but it was more complicated than she'd let on to Cross when she first proposed it. She'd heard about the Hendersons from Pete, who'd mentioned them in passing older couple, 3 kids grown and gone, working more land than 2 people could manage, but with a root cellar full of vegetables, they couldn't get to town before the cold set in. She'd been turning the problem over in her head for 4 days before she proposed it. What she wanted: fresh vegetables, potatoes, some dried corn, possibly preserved fruit if the Henderson woman had been putting up jars. What she had to offer: skilled labor. Not hers directly, but the ranch's. She worked out the terms on paper, the kind of paper negotiation, where you figure out what each side actually needs underneath what they're asking for, and then you find the place where those needs intersect. The Hendersons needed fence work done before the hard freeze. They had a long run of fence along the eastern property line that was failing, and they didn't have the bodies to fix it. Iron Creek had hands who could do fence work, and had Evelyn who could negotiate. She brought the proposal to Cross with the numbers already worked out. He read it twice. "You got all this from a conversation with Pete," he said. And some time thinking about it, he read it a third time. "This saves us $8 on the supply order and gets us fresh vegetables for 6 weeks. And it gives the Hendersons the fence work they need before the ground freezes. Both sides get something they couldn't get alone." He looked at her across the table. There was something in that look she'd seen growing over the past 3 weeks. Not the wariness from the first day, not the skeptical assessment of someone deciding how much to bet on an unknown quantity. Something more like the look of a man realizing he'd been standing next to a well and didn't know how deep it went. "I'll send 2 men to the Henderson place Thursday," he said. "I'd like to go with them," she said, "to handle the exchange directly." A pause. "Vail will. Mr. Vail can note his concerns for the record," she said. "But I'm the one who knows what I need from that root cellar, and I'm the one who knows how to talk to a farm wife about her preserves. Send me with the men and you'll get a better deal." Another pause, then a short tired sound that was close to a laugh. "Thursday." The Henderson farm was 7 miles west, through frozen ground, and she took Thomas with her, because he was old enough to be useful, and because leaving him behind meant leaving him in the orbit of a ranch day that occasionally had unpredictable edges. 2 ranch hands sent along were Pete and a quiet man named Sawyer, who'd been at Iron Creek longer than anyone else and moved through the world with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Sawyer had barely spoken 3 full sentences to her since she'd arrived. On the ride to the Henderson place, he told her, without preamble, that he'd been thinking about the cornbread and he thought she was using too much fat. She considered this seriously. "What makes you say that?" "My grandmother made cornbread. The texture's different. Your version is softer. A lot of people prefer it softer." "I'm not saying it's wrong," he said. "I'm saying it's different." She thought about it for a beat. What kind of cornmeal did she use? He described it. It was a coarser grind than what she'd been working with, which would explain the texture difference, and actually she'd been thinking about the grind herself, but hadn't connected it to that particular comparison. "If I can get coarser meal in the next supply order, I'll try it," she said. He nodded. That was the end of that conversation, but it was the longest exchange she'd had with him, and she filed it away. The Henderson farm appeared in a hollow between 2 low hills. Ruth Henderson came out to meet them before they'd finished dismounting. A small woman in her 60s, with a direct gaze and the kind of handshake that told you immediately she'd spent her life doing real work. Her husband Edgar came out behind her, moving more slowly, and Evelyn registered the slight list to his left side, with the eye she'd developed for these things. "You're the cook from Iron Creek," Ruth said. "Evelyn Hartwell." "Yes, heard about you." She looked Evelyn over the way women who've survived. Difficult things look at other women they're trying to assess. "Heard you walked 12 miles with 3 children to ask for the job." 12 and a half maybe, Evelyn said. Ruth made a sound. It was close to approval. "Come in and look at what we've got." The root cellar was better than Evelyn had hoped. She worked through it systematically, Ruth beside her, and Thomas behind them both. And she was precise about what she wanted and honest about what she'd use versus what would go to waste and what she was in a position to offer in return. Ruth bargained hard but cleanly, the way people who grow things tend to bargain. No patience for nonsense, but no appetite for cruelty either. They came to terms in 40 minutes. Potatoes, winter squash, dried corn, 6 jars of preserved tomatoes, 4 of apple butter. In exchange, 2 days of fence work from the Iron Creek hands, plus a share of the next supply run surplus flour. They shook hands. "You're running that kitchen, right?" Ruth said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an assessment delivered by someone who would know. Iron Creek had a rough few years. "Good to hear there's something working over there." "It's getting there," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at Thomas, who was carrying a crate of squash to the wagon, with the careful attention of a boy trying to prove something. "Good-looking boy," she said. "He's got your eyes." "His father's jaw," Evelyn said. "It'll cause him trouble eventually." Ruth laughed. "It was the real kind, they all do." They got back to Iron Creek in the late afternoon, and Evelyn went directly to the root cellar to organize the new supplies before the cold deepened. Clara and Margaret had been with the ranch during the trip. Margaret had apparently spent the morning explaining to Calhoun, at length, exactly how she thought the water barrel placement could be improved, and Calhoun had listened with more patience than she probably deserved, which made Evelyn like him a little more than she already had. She was in the root cellar, organizing the squash by size the way her mother had taught her, when she heard boots on the steps behind her and turned expecting Cross. It was Vale. He stood at the bottom of the cellar steps, with his arms at his sides, not crossed for once, which she noticed. "Goodall," he said. He was looking at the squash. "Yes." A silence that had a different quality than their usual ones. "Henderson's been sitting on those vegetables," he said. "Couldn't get them to town." "I knew that. Hadn't figured out the trade angle." She waited. "That was good thinking," he said. "It cost him something to say it." She could see that. It wasn't a comfortable sentence for him, and he'd said it anyway. "Thank you," she said. She kept her voice even, neither making too much of it nor dismissing it. He nodded once. He went back up the steps. She turned back to the squash and kept working, but something in her chest had loosened slightly. The particular way something loosens when a problem you've been carrying for a while starts to show its first real crack. The fourth week brought something she hadn't expected. The men started talking to each other differently. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or visible turning point, but she noticed it. The quality of the talk at mealtimes had shifted from the functional minimum of men sharing a table because they had to, towards something with more ease in it. Calhoun had started telling stories, which he apparently had a gift for once he got comfortable enough to start. The kind of stories that made the other men argue about details or add their own versions. Pete had started making observations that were quietly funny in ways the others picked up on. Even Sawyer had been observed by Thomas, who reported this with great seriousness, to have smiled during a breakfast conversation about horses. Kitchen had become the room where the day started and ended, not just in the functional sense, but in the sense of place. It was where you came in from the cold and felt the difference between outside and inside in a way that mattered. It was where the smell of something cooking told you there was a future to walk into, even if the future was only as far as the next meal. Evelyn was aware of what she was doing, and she was also aware that what she was doing was not just cooking. She was doing what her mother had done in the logging camp kitchen, and what her grandmother had done before that, and what women in difficult circumstances had been doing for. As long as there had been difficult circumstances, she was making a place for people to be human in. That wasn't a small thing. Most people didn't recognize it as work, because it didn't look like work from the outside. It looked like food on a table. It looked like a clean floor and a warm room. It looked like the kind of thing that just happened. It didn't just happen, it happened because someone made it happen every day with attention and planning and the willingness to get up at 4 a.m. and start again. She thought about this on a Sunday afternoon while the crew had their rest hour and the kitchen was quiet for once. Clara had fallen asleep against her side. Margaret was in the corner writing something in the margins of Thomas's history book, which Thomas had objected to and then lost interest in objecting to. Thomas himself was outside, somewhere with Pete, still working through whatever chapter they'd been reading. Cross appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the tableau Clara asleep, Margaret writing. The kitchen peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and something crossed his face that he didn't quite manage to keep back. "I wanted to let you know," he said, keeping his voice low for the sleeping child, "that I heard from the bank." She looked up. Her stomach tightened, in the way it always tightened when banks were mentioned. "There's a final accounting coming," he said. "End of next month. They want to see evidence of operational recovery, or they start proceedings." Kept her face steady. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that what you've been doing here matters more than I made it seem when I hired you." He looked at the floor. "I should have been straight with you from the start. I was embarrassed about how close to the edge we are." Thought about what to say. "What do you need?" she asked. He looked up. "To show them numbers make sense," he said. "Revenue? Expenses? Efficiency. Right now, the efficiency numbers are the best thing I have, and a big part of why they've improved is sitting in this kitchen. She was quiet for a moment. I want to see the full expense breakdown, she said. Everything. Not just the kitchen budget. The whole operation. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to be useful with one hand tied, she said. If what I do here matters to the ranch staying open, then I need to understand the ranch. All of it. A long silence. Clara shifted in her sleep against Evelyn's side and made a small sound and settled again. Cross looked at the child, then at Evelyn. Come to the office tomorrow morning, he said. After breakfast. I'll have the books ready. She nodded. He left. She sat in the quiet kitchen with her daughter's weight against her and thought about numbers. The particular kind of numbers that stood between a place like this and the end of everything it had been built to. She began in the back of her mind to plan. The books were worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected bad. Cross had laid them out on the desk in the ranch office, the morning after their conversation in the kitchen. 3 ledgers, a stack of receipts held together with a length of twine, and a single folded letter from the Territorial Bank of Black Hollow that he set on top of the pile without comment. She read the letter first. It was written in the careful language of men who deal in consequences, and what it said underneath the careful language was, 37 days, and then we begin proceedings. She set the letter down and opened the first ledger. Cross sat across from her and watched her read. He didn't explain or annotate. She appreciated that. She'd worked with men who couldn't watch a woman read a financial document without feeling compelled to translate it for her, as though numbers changed meaning depending on who was looking at them. She spent 40 minutes going through everything. She made notes on a separate piece of paper, her own shorthand, the kind she'd developed over years of managing a household budget that had less room in it than the numbers officially suggested. When she finished, she set her pencil down and looked at what she'd written. Your feed costs are too high, she said. Cross nodded slowly. I know, you're buying from Callaway's in town. There's a mill operation 12 miles east that sells at a lower rate. I heard Pete mention it. The 12 miles is the problem. The delivery cost cancels the savings if you're taking small loads. But if you consolidate the orders, if you're not buying feed every 2 weeks but every 4 weeks in larger volume, the math changes. She tapped her paper. I worked it out. You'd save approximately $19 per quarter on feed alone. He was quiet. The wage structure is the other thing, she said. She said it carefully, because she was aware this was the most personal part of what she was about to tell him. You're paying 8 men the same base rate regardless of skill differential. The men who do specialized work, Sawyer, specifically, and Pete, when it comes to the horses, are being compensated the same as Calhoun, who's useful but still learning. That's not sustainable from a retention standpoint. Good men leave when they feel the work they're doing isn't distinguished from work that requires less. Cross rubbed his jaw. I can't afford to raise wages right now. I'm not suggesting you raise wages across the board. I'm suggesting you restructure. Keep the base rate where it is. Add a skill differential for the 2 or 3 men whose work is genuinely harder to replace. Costs less than losing them and having to find and train someone new. He looked at her across the desk. You worked all this out since last night, he said. I was awake, she said simply. I think better when I have a problem to work on. He picked up one of her notes and read it. Set it back down. The bank's not going to care about feed cost restructuring. They want to see revenue. I know, the revenue problem is separate and it's harder. She paused. Tell me about the cattle. So he told her. He laid it out the way a man talks about something that's been worrying him. For so long, he's nearly stopped feeling it as worry and started feeling it as weather. Just a condition of existing, nothing to be done. The herd was smaller than it should be. 2 hard winters and 1 bad season of disease had taken significant losses. What remained was healthy, but not enough for a strong drive. Plan had been to build back the herd over 2 years, but the bank's timeline didn't allow for 2 years. What if the drive isn't the only revenue path? She said. He looked at her. You have the Henderson arrangement now. That's a trade relationship. What other farms are in a similar situation? Goods they can't move, needs they can't fill on their own. This isn't a trading post, he said. It wasn't hostile, just factual. No, she agreed. But you have labor, storage, transport capability, and a location that several smaller farms would benefit from access to. Not permanently, just for the season between harvest and when the ground locks up. She let him think about that. If 3 farms can move their surplus through you at a small percentage, and you consolidate the supply runs to reduce everyone's individual transport cost, You generate revenue without touching the cattle operation, and you build relationships that benefit the ranch for years. A long silence. Outside the office window, she could hear the yard coming to life. The sounds of the morning crew moving, Calhoun's voice, something metallic being shifted near the barn. Where did you learn to think like this? Cross said. I told you the last 16 months. She picked up her pencil again. And before that, watching my father manage a camp that should have gone under 3 times and didn't because he was creative about what he had to work with. Your father was a businessman? He was a man who couldn't afford to fail, she said. Same thing when it counts. Cross was looking at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. The one that appeared when something she said landed something in him that he hadn't expected to be hit. Covered it the same way each time, by looking at papers or out the window, or at some middle distance that wasn't quite her. I'll write to the Harmon farm in the Delacroix operations east of Henderson's, he said. Feel out the interest. I'll draft the letter if you want. I know what terms to propose. He looked at her again. All right, he said. She drafted the letters that afternoon during the rest hour, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara asleep in the back room, and the quiet of the ranch settling around her. She wrote them twice each, a rough version, first to get the ideas in order, then a clean version that said the same things with the right weight in the right places. Business correspondence was its own kind of cooking, she thought. You had to know which ingredients to lead with and which to fold in quietly, and you had to know when you'd said enough and stop before you overseasoned. Cross read both letters that evening. He made 2 small changes to the wording, which she noted were improvements, and signed them. Pete took them to town the next morning. The response from Harmon came back in 4 days. Yes, they were interested. They had winter squash, dried beans, some salted pork from the fall slaughter that they couldn't move without a longer trip to market than they could manage this late in the season. What were the terms? Evelyn wrote the response. Cross, who had started reading her drafts before signing them with decreasing amounts of revision, read this one and signed it without changing a word. The Delacroix response took a week and was more complicated. Old Francois Delacroix was 73 and had been farming the same land for 40 years, and had opinions about the way business should be conducted that had been formed in an era Evelyn had never lived in. He wanted to speak to the owner directly, which she'd expected, and Cross rode out to his farm on a Thursday and spent most of the afternoon in negotiation. He came back with a deal that was somewhat less favorable than what she'd proposed, but still represented real value. He wanted to know who was running the operation. Cross told her when he returned. What did you tell him? I told him the ranch management was mine and the logistics were handled by my cook. He paused. He said a woman who can organize a supply chain while running a kitchen is worth paying attention to. She allowed herself to feel something about that for approximately 4 seconds and then moved on. What were the final terms? She asked. He told her. She revised the accounting accordingly. It was the Thursday of the 5th week when Gideon Vale made his real move. She knew something was wrong before she knew what it was. That particular sensitivity you develop when you've been in a situation long enough to know its normal rhythms, and something has broken the rhythm. The morning had felt off in a way she couldn't immediately locate. The crew at breakfast had been quiet in the wrong way. Not the comfortable quiet of men focused on food, but something edged, eyes sliding sideways. Pete had looked at her once quickly, and then looked away. She'd noted it and kept working. After the morning meal, when the yard was busy, and Cross was somewhere in the north pasture with 2 of the hands checking fence line, Vale appeared at the kitchen door. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway the way he'd done in the early weeks, filling the space, and he had a piece of paper in his hand. I need to talk to you, he said. I'm listening, she said. She was drying a pot. She kept drying it, not here. He glanced at Margaret, who was at the far end of the kitchen sorting dried beans, a task she'd invented for herself, separating the beans by whether she thought they were pretty, which was not a rigorous sorting method, but had the incidental benefit of also catching the damaged ones. Alone, she set the pot down. She looked at Margaret. Go check on your sister, she said. Margaret looked between them, read the room with the accuracy of a 9-year-old who had lived through enough adult difficulty to have developed early instincts about when adults needed the space, and went. Evelyn turned to Vale. Say what you came to say, she said. Came in. He set the piece of paper on the work table between them. It was a letter. She could see the heading from where she stood. This came for Cross yesterday, Vale said. I signed for it when the writer came. I read it. She looked at the letter, then at him. That's not your letter to read, she said. No, it's not, he said it flatly, without apology. But I read it anyway. Because this ranch is my responsibility as much as it's his, and because I had a feeling. He pushed the letter slightly toward her. It's from a man named Aldous Crane. He's a land broker out of the territorial capital. He's been talking to the bank. She picked up the letter. She read it. The language was careful, the same kind of careful as the bank's letter had been, but what it said underneath was different. Crane was proposing to purchase the Iron Creek land in the event of bank foreclosure. He'd already been in communication with the bank's regional officer. He was, as he put it, prepared to move quickly once the determination was made. He's already got a deal with the bank, she said. Looks like it. The foreclosure isn't a possibility. Plan. Vale's voice had a different quality than she was used to from him. Not unfriendly exactly, but stripped of the usual layers of performance. This was just a man talking about a problem. Cross doesn't know yet. She set the letter down. Why are you telling me? She asked. Pause. Because you're the one who's been trying to fix things. He looked at the letter. And because if this goes through, all of it, everything you've done in the last 5 weeks doesn't matter. She stood very still. The kitchen was quiet around her, the fire in the stove making its low sound, the cold pressing against the window. How much time, she said. The bank letter gave 37 days. That was 18 days ago. 19 days. She picked up the letter and folded it precisely along its original creases. Cross needs to see this today, she said. I know. Will you tell him or will I? Another pause. I'll tell him, Vale said. Came addressed to him. She handed the letter back. Took it. He looked at her with something in his expression that she still couldn't entirely read. It was complex in a way that Vale's expressions usually weren't, or at least in a way she hadn't seen from him before. For what it's worth, he said. The things I said to Cross. About you. About your being here. He stopped, started again. I was looking for a reason to be right about something when everything else was going wrong. It was easier to be right about you being wrong for this place than to look at what was actually broken. She held his gaze. I know, she said. He nodded once. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. Then she sat down at the work table and picked up her pencil and started thinking about 19 days. Cross came to the kitchen that afternoon with the letter in his hand and something in his face that she recognized as a man who has been hit and is deciding whether to stay standing. He sat down across from her without being invited. He set the letter on the table between them. Gideon showed me, he said. I know. Crane has been in talks with the bank for 2 months, before I even got the final notice. He said it with a flatness that had anger under it, the specific anger of someone who's realized that the game was rigged before they sat down to play. They were never going to give me a real chance. Maybe, she said. But you have 19 days and a better position than you had 5 weeks ago. He looked at her, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. The trade arrangements aren't enough. Not in 19 days. The Harmon deal and the Delacroix arrangement together generate maybe $40 in the quarter. The outstanding debt is, he stopped. I know what the outstanding debt is, she said. I've been through the books. Then you know $40 doesn't move it. $40 doesn't move it, she agreed. But $40 plus a credible operational plan, plus documented efficiency improvements, plus active trade relationships with 3 neighboring properties creates a different picture than a failing ranch with one revenue stream and no clear path. She paused. The bank isn't just looking at numbers. They're looking at viability, at whether this is worth more to them as a going operation than as a land sale to Crane. He was quiet. Crane's offer to them is clean, she said. No complications. But it's also probably he's buying distressed land and he knows the bank knows it. If you can present a credible case that Iron Creek's recovery value exceeds what Crane's offering, the bank has a financial incentive to give you more time. Cross stared at the letter. You can build that case, she said. I'll help you build it. On what basis? On the basis of what's actually happened here in the last 5 weeks. Efficiency numbers, the trade arrangements, the crew retention, ply restructuring. She met his eyes. And on the basis of what's possible if you get 6 more months. I'll put it in writing. Projected numbers, specific plans, timelines. Things a banker can hold in his hand and calculate. A long silence. Outside she heard Thomas's voice, and then Pete's, the two of them somewhere near the barn, the low back and forth of their reading sessions, having apparently migrated outdoors despite the cold. Why are you doing this? Cross asked. He asked it quietly without accusation. He genuinely wanted to know. She thought about that. Because my children have been sleeping in a room off this kitchen for 5 weeks, she said. And because the crew that's been eating at that table has started to feel like something. And because I spent 6 months trying to save something that I couldn't save, and I'd like to try again with something that's actually salvageable." She paused. "And because I told you I could prove my worth. I'd like to see that through." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do first?" They worked for 3 days on the presentation for the bank. Evelyn drafted the core document operational summary, efficiency analysis, trade arrangement projections, crew retention data, and cross-reviewed and added the ranching-specific context that she didn't have the expertise to supply. It was a different kind of collaboration than she'd had with anyone in years, maybe ever genuinely equal in the sense that each of them had something the other lacked, and both of them knew it. Vale, who had been informed of the plan with the careful neutrality of someone deciding whether to invest in a long shot, had contributed the one thing nobody expected. He'd produced, from whatever recess of memory or record he kept things in, precise figures from Iron Creek's operational peak 5 years ago, including the wage structure, the production numbers, and the per-head cost data from the best drive year the ranch had managed. "This is what you're trying to get back to," he told Cross, setting the papers down. "I know what I'm trying to get back to," Cross said. "Put it in the document," Vale said with a glance at Evelyn. "Side by side with where you are now and where the projections say you'll be in 6 months. Banks like before and after. It makes the math feel inevitable." Evelyn looked at Vale. He looked back with the expression of a man who had decided to be useful and was mildly irritated by how uncomplicated that decision had turned out to be. Comparative figures. On the 16th day, 3 days before the bank's deadline, Cross rode to Black Hollow with the document, Vale's beside him, and Evelyn at the kitchen at 5 in the morning starting the day's work, because the work still needed doing, regardless of what was happening in town. The children felt the tension without being told about it. Clara stayed closer than usual, finding reasons to be in the kitchen. Margaret's conversation was quieter and more careful than her default. Thomas did his chores without being reminded, which was notable enough that Pete commented on it, with the brevity of a man who understood what it meant. Pete himself came to the kitchen mid-morning, ostensibly for coffee, and sat at the table without pouring any. "They'll be back by afternoon," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. She was working dough for the noon bread. The repetitive work of it was useful. "Cross is a straight talker," Pete said. "Banks like that. Or they should." He paused. "You put together a good argument." "We put together a good argument," she said. He looked at his empty cup. "I've been at this ranch 9 years," he said. "Came when it was doing well. Stayed through the bad years because he stopped." "Well, they're staying somewhere and they're staying somewhere. You understand that." She understood that. "I'd like to see it come through," he said. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was just saying a true thing. "So would I," she said. He poured his coffee and took it back to wherever he'd come from. Cross and Vale returned at 3:30 in the afternoon. She heard the horses before she saw them. She was at the kitchen window, and she watched them come through the gate, 2 men on horseback, and she tried to read what she could from the distance and the angle. Cross dismounted. He handed the reins to Calhoun. He stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the ground. Then he looked up toward the kitchen window. She couldn't see his expression clearly from the distance, but she saw him nod one deliberate nod, and something in her chest unclenched so completely that she had to put her hand on the windowsill. He came in through the kitchen door. He looked tired in the same deep way. He always looked tired, but something in it was different. Less weight to it. "They're giving us 90 days, he said. She exhaled. "Conditional," he said. "Monthly reporting. Specific benchmarks. If we miss any of the projected targets in the plan, they reserve the right to revisit." 90 days is enough," she said. He looked at her. "The Harmon arrangement settled," he said. "Delacroix confirmed a second load. And while we were in town, Gideon talked to a man named Birch, who's running a small cattle operation north of the Henderson place. He might have stock to sell at a price that makes sense." She took all of this in. "Gideon talked to him," she said. "Apparently." Cross looked faintly surprised himself. "They have some history." Gideon didn't explain. She absorbed the information and filed it. "The bread needs another 20 minutes, she said. "Sit down. You both look like you haven't eaten since this morning." Cross sat. He put his hat on the table and rubbed his face with both hands. The gesture of a man who has been holding himself at a particular tension and is allowing himself, very carefully, to release it. "You know," he said, into his hands, "when I hired you, I was doing it because I was out of options. I thought you'd manage the meals and keep the crew from walking off, and that would be something. Kept working. And then you walked into my office and told me the feed costs were wrong," he said. He dropped his hands. He looked at her with the directness that she'd come to understand was his particular mode of honesty. Not polished, not performative, just real. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely know what to do with it. You don't need to do anything with it, she said. It's just how I work. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, he said. She looked up from the bread. He looked like he was about to say something, and then thought better of it, or thought harder about it. She couldn't tell which. Thank you, he said, for the last 5 weeks. For all of it. She nodded. She turned back to the bread. But she was aware, in the particular way she was aware of things that mattered, of the quality of the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of two people who had nothing more to say. It was the silence of people who had more to say than they were ready to say it. She let it be what it was. That evening, after the crew's dinner and the dishes and the children settled, Vale found her in the yard. This was unusual enough that she stopped and waited. He stood about 6 feet from her, with his hands at his sides and the cold dark of the evening around them both, and he looked like a man in the middle of a decision. What I said to Cross, he started, when I told him the town was talking, that keeping you here was going to damage his reputation. He stopped. Some of it was true. People did talk. I know they did, she said, but I made more of it than it was. I took a small thing and I made it big, because I wanted... He stopped again. I wanted a reason, something I could point to. She waited. The truth is, he said, you scared me. She looked at him. Not you personally, he said, with the halting specificity of someone who has been practicing what they want to sissy, and is now finding the practice insufficient. What you represent. A person who comes in and does things differently than they've been done and gets results. It means everything I've been doing all these years. He looked away. It makes you wonder if you've been doing it wrong. And that's a hard thing to sit with. She thought about what to say. Thought about the honest answer, which was that he hadn't been entirely wrong about her. She wasn't easy to have around. She knew that. She asked for authority she hadn't been given, and pushed on doors that hadn't been opened to her, and made people uncomfortable by refusing to make herself smaller, but also that none of that was the same as being wrong for the place. You kept this ranch alive, she said, through 2 bad years and a shrinking crew and a financial situation that would have broken a less stubborn man. You kept it alive long enough for someone to come along and help it recover. That's not nothing, Gideon. It was the first time she'd used his name. He stood very still. It's not the same as what you've done, he said. No, she agreed. It's different. But different work doesn't mean lesser work. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. I'm going to talk to Birch next week, he said, about the cattle. If we can get a dozen head at the right price, it changes the herd numbers significantly. She said. You should know the plan, he said, since you'll be here. She understood what that meant. Not just the sentence, the fact of the sentence. He was telling her he'd stop trying to arrange her departure. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded. He walked back toward the bunkhouse. She stood in the cold yard alone and looked up at the sky, which was wide and dark and full of stars in the particular extravagant way of frontier winter nights. She let herself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite peace, but was in that direction. 30 seconds. Then she went inside, because tomorrow's supply accounting wasn't going to do itself, and she had a kitchen to run. She was at the work table late that night, the children long asleep and the ranch quiet around her, when she heard the floorboard outside the kitchen creak in the specific way it creaked when someone of Cross's weight stepped on it. She didn't look up from her accounting. I thought you'd be asleep, she said. Couldn't. He came in. He stood on the other side of the work table. He looked at what she was working on. You're doing the monthly report for the bank. Getting ahead of it, she said. The first one is due in 30 days. I want it to look like we expected it. He picked up one of the sheets and read it. Set it back down, Evelyn, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been seeing more often, the one he couldn't quite manage to keep off his face when he forgot to be careful about it. She'd been letting herself not examine it too closely, because examining it closely meant deciding what to do about it, and she had enough decisions in front of her. I need to say something, he said, and I need you to hear it as something real and not as I don't know. Not as something a man says when he's grateful or when he stopped. Started again. I've been watching you for 5 weeks. How you work, how you think, how you are with your children and with the crew and with problems that would make most people walk away. He was looking at her steadily now. I'm not the same as I was when you got here. And it's not the ranch I'm talking about. She held very still. I understand if that's not something you want to hear, he said. You've got enough to manage without me adding to it. And I'm aware that I'm the man who hired you, And that creates a situation where you might feel. Nathaniel, she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the work table, with the lamp between them and the quiet of the sleeping ranch all around, and she said, I hear you. Just that. He stood there. I need time, she said. Not because I don't. She paused, choosing the words carefully. Not because what you're saying doesn't land somewhere, but because I've been surviving for a year and a half, and I've gotten very good at surviving. And I don't know yet how to do something other than that. I need to figure that out before I know what else I'm capable of. He nodded slowly. That's fair, he said. That's completely fair. Give me time, she said. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep being what you've been being. And give me time. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table edge. As much as you need, he said. He went to bed. She sat at the work table alone with the lamp and the accounting papers in the quiet, and she pressed her hands flat against the wood and felt her own heartbeat and thought, all right, all right. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. The days after that conversation had a different texture. Nothing changed visibly. Cross was at breakfast the same time he always was, sitting at the far end of the table with his coffee, and whatever was pressing on him that morning, and he was the same as he'd always been, direct when he spoke, quiet when he was thinking, not a man who performed his moods for an audience. He didn't look at her differently in front of the crew. He didn't create situations where they'd be alone. He'd said what he has said, and then he'd stepped back from it and given her the space he'd promised, and she found herself appreciating that more than almost anything else he'd done since she arrived. She was also acutely aware of it in the specific way you become, aware of something you've been told not to think about. Put that awareness in the same place she put most of the things she wasn't ready to deal with. The back shelf, accessible when needed, not on the main counter taking up working space, and she got on with the work. The work in those days after the bank's conditional approval had a different quality too. Before, she'd been proving something, demonstrating capability to an audience that wasn't sure she belonged. Now the proving was done, at least provisionally, and what was left was the actual job of building something, rather than just defending her right to try. In some ways, proving yourself against resistance has a clarity to it. You know what you're fighting, and you know what winning looks like. Building something is messier. The edges are uncertain. You make choices that won't be evaluated for months. She made them anyway. The trade arrangement with Harmon settled into a reliable rhythm. The first exchange had gone smoothly enough that Nathan Harmon had sent a letter addressed to Evelyn directly, asking if Iron Creek would be interested in a standing arrangement through the spring. She'd drafted the response and Cross had signed it. The Delacroix arrangement was more complex, because Francois Delacroix was more complex. But she'd been corresponding with his daughter Isabelle, who was the one actually managing the farm's operations, and who had a directness that Evelyn found refreshing after weeks of navigating the older man's protocols. Isabelle had proposed a modification to the original terms that was, on examination, better for both parties. Evelyn had agreed. You're running a trade network, Cross said one evening, looking at the correspondence on the kitchen table. I'm running a kitchen, she said. The network is just what the kitchen requires. He looked at the stack of letters. Isabelle Delacroix wants to meet you. She said so in the postscript. Evelyn looked at the postscript. She hadn't read the letters out loud to him. He'd been reading over her shoulder, which she'd noted but not addressed. I know, she's worth knowing. The Delacroix family has been in this territory for 30 years. They know everyone. I'll write back and suggest a meeting in town, when the ground allows for easier travel, she said. Picked up her pencil. Was there something else? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. He went to bed, kept writing. The cattle purchase from Birch went through in the third week of the 90-day period. Vale had ridden out twice to negotiate, which represented a version of Gideon Vale that she was still adjusting to a man who used his formidable stubbornness in service of the ranch's interests, rather than in service of his own resistance to change. He'd come back from the second ride with a price that Cross said was $12 below what he'd expected to pay, and a delivery date of 10 days out. 12 head, Vale said, at the kitchen table that evening. He was eating the last of the potato stew and had accepted a second helping without being asked, which she'd noted as its own kind of landmark. Good stock. Birch keeps clean animals. I've seen his operation. That brings the herd to what number? Evelyn asked. Cross told her. She did the math in her head and wrote it at the bottom of the page she was working on. 12 additional head. The spring drive projection changed meaningfully. Not enough to clear the debt, but enough to demonstrate to the bank that the herd recovery was real and moving at a credible pace. I want to add it to the monthly report, she said. The report isn't due for another 2 weeks, Cross said. I know. But if we submit it early with this news in it, it signals something. It says we're not managing to deadline. We're managing ahead of it. Vale looked at her from across his stew. That's a bank game, he said. Yes, she agreed, and the bank is playing a game with us. Play back. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't the contrary position either. Cross looked at Vale. Some communication passed between them, the shorthand of men who'd worked alongside each other for years, and then Cross looked at Evelyn. Write the report, he said. Thomas came to her on a Tuesday evening, while she was mending a tear in Clara's coat, sitting on the edge of the cot in the small room while the younger children slept. Came in quietly, which was how he did everything when he was being serious, and sat on the floor near the door with his knees pulled up. She kept mending. Pete says Calhoun's cousin finally wrote back, Thomas said. Says he's not coming. I know. Mr. Cross mentioned it. Pete says that means they're still 2 hands short of what they need for the spring drive. Probably right. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had the particular quiet of an 11-year-old who has something real to say and is trying to find the right opening for it. Could help, he said. With the drive, I'm strong enough. Pete says I sit a horse better than most boys he's seen. She kept her eyes on the mending. Pete is kind. He's not kind. He doesn't say things to be kind. You know that. Thomas's voice had a careful urgency in it. He says what's true. He told Calhoun his rope work was poor, and Calhoun had to go practice for a week before Pete said anything different. She did know that. Pete's opinions were not offered for comfort. A cattle drive is not a safe undertaking, she said. I'm not asking for safe, Thomas said. I'm asking to be useful. She set the mending down and looked at her son. He had his father's jaw, set exactly the way his father's jaw used to set that particular combination of stubbornness and earnestness that she'd loved and occasionally wanted to throw things at during the 12 years of her marriage. You are useful, she said. You've been useful every day since we got here. I mean useful in the way that counts for the ranch. He paused. I know you're trying to save it. I'm not stupid. I know what the bank letters mean, and I know what happens if the numbers don't work out. I want to help make the numbers work out. She was quiet. He was 11 years old, and he was talking about financial solvency and cattle drives, and she thought, Daniel, look at your son. Look at what he's become, while I wasn't watching closely enough to see it happen. I'll talk to Mr. Cross, she said. Thomas let out a careful breath. Thank you. I'm not promising anything, she said. I know. He went to his side of the sleeping arrangement, the floor near the wall which he'd claimed and defended against Margaret's occasional territorial expansions, and she picked up the mending and finished it in the lamplight, thinking about her son's jaw and her husband's jaw and the line between the two. She talked to Cross the next morning. He heard her out without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him, the ability to listen to a full idea before responding. He didn't fill the space with his own thoughts while she was still putting something down. He's 11, he said when she'd finished. He's a capable 11. And Pete vouches for the horsemanship. A drive isn't about horsemanship alone. I know that. He knows that. She looked at him steadily. He wants to contribute to something that matters to his family. I think that's worth taking seriously. Cross looked at the middle distance. She knew he was actually thinking about it, not just waiting to say no. He'd need to stay on the flank, he said finally. Not point, not drag. Flank where I can keep some eye on him, and where the work is real but the exposure is manageable. And he takes orders without question. Not from me only. From Vale and from Sawyer. He will, she said. You're sure? I raised him, she said, I'm sure. Cross nodded. One nod deliberate, the same way he'd nodded at her from the yard after the bank meeting. The nod that meant something was settled. Tell him to talk to Pete this week, he said. Start learning the terminology. The drive's 8 weeks out, weather depending. She said she would. She went back to the kitchen and told Thomas, who received the news with the specific controlled reaction of a boy, trying very hard not to look like it was the best thing that had happened to him in recent memory. Meant it was absolutely the best thing that had happened to him in recent memory. Just the flank, she told him. Yes, ma'am, he said, already heading for the door. Thomas. He stopped. Thank your mother before you go. Thank Pete, she said. He came back and hugged her with the brief, fierce efficiency of a boy who was trying to be older than he was, and then he was gone. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. All right, she thought. All right. The second monthly report went to the bank on a Wednesday 6 days early. It included the cattle acquisition, the updated trade arrangement projections, the crew retention data, and a revised efficiency analysis that Evelyn had spent 4 days refining until the numbers told their story as clearly and unambiguously as she could make them. She'd also included, at the bottom of the operational summary, a single paragraph she'd written and rewritten 7 times before she was satisfied with it. It laid out the ranch's trajectory in plain language, where it had been 60 days ago, where it was now, where the specific benchmarks indicated it would be in another 60. No promises, no rhetoric, just the arithmetic of recovery, laid out so that a man sitting behind a bank desk could see it without having to work for it. Cross read it before they sealed the envelope. "This last part," he said. He indicated the paragraph. "This is good. It's honest," she said. "The same as good in this case." He looked at her. "Where did you learn to write like that?" "I read a lot," she said. "And I wrote a lot of letters to people who didn't want to hear what I had to say, and I had to find ways to say it, so they'd listen anyway." She took the report and folded it into the envelope. "Survival teaches you communication whether you want it to or not." He sealed the envelope. "I'll ride it to town tomorrow," he said. "Send it with Pete," she said. "You're needed here. The Birch cattle are arriving Thursday, and someone who knows what they're looking at should be in the yard when they come in." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been carefully not examining. He went to find Pete. Cattle arrived Thursday afternoon, 12 animals in reasonable condition after a 2-day drive, and the yard had the particular controlled chaos of new animals being introduced to a settled space. Cross was in the middle of it, and Vale, and Sawyer, who came alive in the presence of livestock, in a way he didn't in other circumstances. His usual economy of motion became something more like fluency. Thomas was at the fence watching with the focused attention he gave to things he intended to learn. Evelyn kept the kitchen going through all of it, because the crew's appetite didn't pause for cattle deliveries, and because there was something grounding about the smell of the cooking and the work of her hands, while the yard was loud and complicated. Clara came to stand beside her at the stove. "Are those ours now?" Clara asked, watching through the kitchen window. "They belong to the ranch," Evelyn said. "Are we part of the ranch?" Evelyn looked at her youngest child, 7 years old, serious eyes. The question asked with the directness that 7-year-olds bring to things before they learn to dress their questions up in less nakedness. "I think we might be," Evelyn said. Clara considered this. "Good," she said, and went back to her corner. It was Margaret who noticed first. Margaret noticed most things first, which was both her gift and occasionally her liability, but in this case she simply brought it to her mother the way she brought most information she deemed important directly, without preamble, with the assumption that it was wanted. "Mr. Cross looks at you," Margaret said. Was at the kitchen table, eating an apple, and she said it with the same tone she used for other factual observations. Evelyn kept chopping. "He looks at everyone," she said. "Not like that." Margaret crunched her apple. "He looks at other people like he's checking something. He looks at you like he's—" She paused, searching. "Like he's thinking about something." "People think about things," Evelyn said. "Mama." Evelyn set down the knife and looked at her daughter. Margaret looked back with 9-year-old seriousness. "Do you look at him like that too?" The kitchen was quiet. "Eat your apple," Evelyn said. Margaret ate her apple with the expression of a child who has gotten more answer than she expected. It was the 43rd day of the 90 when the letter came from Aldous Crane. It wasn't addressed to Cross this time. It was addressed to Evelyn directly, which told her several things immediately. Crane had been asking around in town, that he'd gotten her name, and that he'd decided she was worth talking to. She opened it at the kitchen table. It was polite. That was the most alarming thing about it. Men who were confident in their position didn't waste hostility on intermediaries. Crane's letter was cordial, complimentary even. He'd heard about the improvements at Iron Creek, he said, and he respected capable management, he said, and he wanted her to know that his interest in the property was nothing personal, simply business, and that in the event of a change in the ranch's status, he would of course ensure that any staff with demonstrated capability would receive favorable consideration in whatever operation he installed. In other words, when this fails, I'll give you a job consolation prize. She read it twice. Then she folded it and took it to Cross. He read it standing in the barn doorway. When he finished, he looked at the paper for a long moment without saying anything. Then he folded it the same way she'd folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "He's nervous," Cross said. "Yes," she said. "He wouldn't be writing to you if he wasn't nervous. If he still had the bank locked up, he wouldn't need to do this." He looked at her. "The report changed something." "Maybe," she said. "Or the bank is playing both sides and Crane is covering his position. Either way, She said it means we're doing something right. And we have 47 days left to make it irreversible. Cross looked at her across the barn doorway. What do you want to do with the letter? He said. File it, she said, and write the third monthly report early. He nodded. She walked back to the kitchen. She didn't tell the children about Crane's letter. They didn't need to carry that. But she did, that evening after dinner, sit with them in the small room and have the conversation she'd been working toward for several weeks. The conversation she'd known was coming. Since the night Cross had sat in the common room with the mouth harp, and she'd stood in the doorway and started to understand something about what Iron Creek had become. She sat on the edge of the cot, and the children arranged themselves in their usual configurations. Thomas on the floor with his back against the wall, Margaret cross-legged on the blanket, Clara pressed against her mother's side. I want to talk to you about something, she said. Thomas looked up from the book he'd been reading. He hadn't been reading. She could tell he'd been waiting for this, or something like it. He was her child, and he'd inherited her tendency to sense things before they arrived. Mr. Cross, he said. Yes, she said, a silence. He's a good man, Thomas said. It was not a question. He is, she said. He's not a perfect man. He's carried a hard few years, and it's left marks on him. But he's honest, and he's steady, and he doesn't take his difficulty out on people around him. He was kind to me about the drive, Thomas said. He was. He didn't have to say yes, Thomas said. He could have said I was too young, and that would have been the end of it, and he didn't. She looked at her son. No, he didn't. Margaret had been quiet through this exchange, which for Margaret was its own kind of statement. Are you going to marry him? She asked. The directness of it was so perfectly Margaret that Evelyn almost laughed. She didn't. I don't know yet, she said. That's the honest answer. He has said things to me that matter, and I'm working out what I think. About all of it. What's there to work out? Margaret asked, with the bafflement of a child who didn't yet understand why adults made simple things complicated. A lot of things, Evelyn said. We've been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks is not a long time to know someone. You knew Papa longer, and you still say he surprised you sometimes, Margaret pointed out. This was accurate. This was annoyingly accurate. That's true, Evelyn said. So you can know someone a long time and still not know everything, Margaret concluded. Which means the length of time doesn't really fix the problem. So what's actually the problem? Thomas was looking at his sister with an expression of reluctant respect. Evelyn sat with the question for a moment. What was actually the problem? I've been surviving, she said finally, for a long time, and I've gotten very good at it. And surviving is a specific way of being in the world. Watching everything carefully and keeping yourself ready to move and not letting yourself need too much from any one thing. Because needing too much from one thing is how you get destroyed when that thing changes. She paused. And what you're describing, Thomas said slowly, working it out as he spoke, is the opposite of that. Yes, she said, needing someone, letting your life be connected to theirs. The opposite of surviving. And I don't know yet how to make that switch. I'm trying to figure out if I can. The room was quiet. Clara had been listening with the focused silence she brought to conversation she was too young for, but refused to be excluded from. She now tilted her head up and looked at her mother. Do you like it here? Clara asked. Yes, Evelyn said. Very much. Do you like him? Evelyn looked at her youngest child. Yes, she said. Then stay, Clara said simply, and tucked her face back against her mother's side. Thomas looked at Clara, then at his mother. He had the expression of someone watching a complicated argument get resolved in 3 words by someone who hadn't been paying attention to the complication. She's not wrong, he said. She's 7, Evelyn said. She's still not wrong, Thomas said. Margaret was nodding with the satisfaction of someone who had asked the right question and gotten the useful result. Evelyn sat with her children in the small room and felt something that was not quite a decision, but was the first clear movement toward one. She slept badly that night. Not from worry exactly. The quality of the wakefulness was different, not the grinding alertness of someone running calculations, but something closer to the feeling before a storm, when the air changes and everything gets sharp and strange. She was at the stove before 4 earlier than usual. She put the kettle on for coffee and stood in the kitchen in the dark and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, which was her version of the thinking that doesn't look like thinking. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of Cross's footsteps on the kitchen floorboards. She knew them now, the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough to have memorized without trying. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in the dark before dawn, his hair not combed yet, his expression carrying the particular openness of a person who hasn't yet assembled the day's armor. He looked at her standing by the stove. Couldn't sleep, he said. No, she said. He came in, he sat down at the table, poured 2 cups of coffee when the kettle was ready, and set one in front of him, and kept one for herself, and sat across from him in the same way they'd sat across from each other over ledgers and supply orders and bank letters for 6 weeks. They sat in the quiet for a while. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right, he said. When you said what you said, about watching me, about not being the same as you were, she held the coffee cup in both hands. Was any of that about the ranch? About what I've done here operationally? He looked at her. No, he said. You're sure? I'm sure. He didn't say it defensively. He said it the way he said things he was certain of, with a quiet finality that didn't invite debate because it didn't need to. I'm grateful for what you've done here. That's a separate thing. I know the difference. She nodded slowly. My children think I should stop making it complicated, she said. Something shifted in his expression. How old are they again? 7, 9, and 11. And what do they think? She looked at him across the table. Thomas says you're a good man. Margaret says the length of time doesn't fix the problem. And Clara says stay. She paused. Clara is 7 and she's the most direct thinker in the family. He was very still. And what do you think, he said. Put down her coffee cup. I think, she said, that I've been surviving for 16 months, and I'm tired of surviving being the whole of it. She met his eyes. I think you're the first person since Daniel who makes me feel like something other than the person holding everything together by herself. And I think that matters more than I've been letting myself say. He didn't move. I think, she continued, that my children are correct and that I've been making it complicated because complicated felt safer. And I think, she stopped, let out a breath. I think if you were to ask me again what you asked me in the common room that night, I might have a different answer than give me time. Kitchen was very quiet. Cross reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony. He put his hand over hers the way a person does when they want to make contact with something real, and she felt the warmth of it and the weight of it and let herself feel both without pulling back. Evelyn, he said. Don't make a speech, she said. I've had enough speeches from men in my life. He smiled at that, a real smile, not the careful expression she usually got from him. I wasn't going to, good. I was just going to say pause. That I'd like to do this right. However right looks is in your terms. With your children. With time. I'm not asking you to change what you are or stop doing what you do or fold yourself into this place like it was waiting for you all along. He turned her hand over in his. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me be part of what comes next. She looked at his hand over hers. She thought about 16 months of early mornings and accounting pages and children who needed breakfast and a kitchen that had gone from a place of abandonment to the center of something. She thought about Clara's hand going still on the first day and about the way that stillness had been the thing that made her stay. Thought about what staying had turned into. Yes, she said. One word, the same finality he used for things he was certain of. Turned her hand over and held it. They sat in the early morning quiet with their coffee cups and the stove beginning to warm the room, and outside the window the ranch was dark and still and starting, in the way of winter mornings, to prepare itself for another day. Hold the children that evening. Not with great ceremony wasn't her style, and they knew it. Told them after dinner, matter-of-factly, the same way she told them most things that mattered. Here is the situation. Here is what's true. Here is what it means. She said that she and Mr. Cross had talked. She said she'd decided to say yes to something she'd been saying, wait on. She said it wasn't going to happen immediately. There were things to work out, proper things, and the ranch's situation needed to be more settled first. And there was no rush, but that the direction was set. Thomas nodded. He had the expression of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. Margaret said, I knew it. I told Clara weeks ago. Clara said, can I call him something besides Mr. Cross? Evelyn looked at her youngest daughter. You can ask him what he'd like you to call him. Clara considered this. I'll ask tomorrow, she said, with the practical efficiency of someone who has already moved past the news and onto the logistics. Thomas was quiet for a moment after his sisters had moved on to other things. Papa would have liked him, Thomas said, quietly. Just for her, she looked at her son. I think so too, she said. He nodded. He went back to his book. She sat in the kitchen alone after the children went to sleep, and she didn't do the accounting or plan the next week's supply order or draft any letters. She just sat, which was something she almost never did, and she let the quiet be around her, and let herself be in it without reaching for the next problem. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen ground of Iron Creek Ranch, and the cattle in the pasture were settled, and the crew in the bunkhouse was quiet, and the kitchen was warm from the fire she'd built before supper and hadn't yet let die. Sat in the warmth she'd made and let herself have the night without working it. It was a long time since she'd done that. It felt that she thought like something beginning. The third monthly report went to the bank on a Thursday, 9 days before the 90-day deadline, and this time Cross didn't send it with Pete. He wrote it in himself, and he took Vale with him, and he was gone most of the day. Evelyn knew better than to wait at the window. She'd learned that much about herself in the past months, that watching for outcomes she couldn't control was the particular kind of useless that also made everything harder. So she cooked. She planned the following week's supply order. She wrote a response to Isabelle Delacroix about the meeting they'd been arranging for when the ground thawed. Kept her hands moving and her mind in the work, which was how she'd gotten through every hard thing in the last 2 years, and it worked about as well as it ever did, which was imperfectly but sufficiently. Clara asked 3 times when Mr. Cross was coming back. Evelyn told her she didn't know. Clara accepted this with the equanimity she'd developed toward uncertain timelines, which was an equanimity born of experience, rather than temperament she'd learned. At 7, that waiting was a skill like any other, and you got better at it if you practiced. The crew ate their noon meal without talking much. They knew, the way crews always know, that something was being decided elsewhere. Sawyer ate with his usual economy. Calhoun tried to start a conversation about the fence line and trailed off after 2 sentences. Pete drank his coffee and watched the road through the window. Cross and Vale rode in at 4:30. Evelyn was at the kitchen window when they came through the gate. She watched Cross dismount, watched him hand off the reins, watched him stand in the yard for a moment, with his hand on the horse's neck. Vale said something to him. Cross nodded. Then Cross looked toward the kitchen. She stepped back from the window. She went to the stove and checked the evening's pot, which didn't need checking. She heard his boots on the porch. She heard the kitchen door. "We need to talk," he said. She turned around. His face was tired. But it was a different tired than the exhaustion she'd been watching for 3 months. Not the tiredness of a man losing ground, but the tiredness of a man who'd been holding his breath for a long time and had finally, cautiously exhaled. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put his hat on the table. He looked at it. "The bank is withdrawing the foreclosure proceedings," he said. Stood very still. The regional officer reviewed the 3rd report alongside the previous 2, he said. Cross stopped, like he was making sure he had the words right. He said the operational trajectory was sufficiently convincing to justify a restructured payment arrangement rather than foreclosure. Longer term, lower monthly, it won't be fast, but it's manageable. And Crane, she said. Crane's purchase offer is void. The bank doesn't need to sell. He looked up from his hat. The officer said, and I want to get this right, he said that the efficiency documentation in the reports was the strongest case he'd seen from a ranch operation in his 12 years at the bank. She sat down across from him, not because her legs gave out, though something in her did loosen so completely that sitting felt necessary, but because she needed to be level with him for what she was feeling, and what she was feeling required her to not be standing above it looking down. "That's good," she said. It was an absurdly small thing to say. She knew that. But the large words weren't available to her at that moment, and she'd learned enough about herself to know that, when the large words weren't available, the small, honest ones were better than reaching for something that didn't fit. Cross looked at her across the table. "Evelyn," he said, "that's your work." Most of what he said was convincing, came directly from what you wrote and documented and arranged. The trade network, the efficiency restructuring, the supply cost analysis. He paused. Vale told him, when the officer asked about management structure, that the ranch logistics had been significantly reorganized under the direction of the operations manager. She looked at him. "Operations manager. That's what he called you." Cross had a quality in his expression she hadn't seen before, something that was proud without being proprietary about it, which was a distinction that mattered. I didn't correct him. She absorbed this. "Is that what I am?" she said. "I think you've been that for about 2 months, he said. Title just caught up. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the yard was moving into late afternoon, the crew coming in from the day's work, Calhoun's voice, the particular sound of the ranch settling toward evening. "Payment arrangement," she said, because she needed to understand the whole picture. "The terms, I have them here." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and smoothed it on the table between them. She picked it up and read it. She read it twice, running the numbers in her head the way she'd been running ranch numbers for 3 months now. Structure was workable, not comfortable. It would require maintaining the efficiency gains and continuing to develop the trade relationships, and the spring drive would need to deliver within the projected range. But workable. Nothing in it required luck. It only required the continuation of what was already happening. She set the paper down. "This is manageable," she said. "I know." He was watching her read the numbers with the expression he'd stopped trying to conceal. "I knew you'd say that. Because it's true. Because you already have a plan for it in your head," he said. "You read those numbers and started calculating before you finished the first line." She looked up. He was right. And they both knew it. And something about being known that accurately by another person was still surprising to her, even now. She'd lived inside her own head for so long that having someone see the inside of it clearly felt like a thing that required adjustment. "We should talk about the spring drive timeline," she said. "We should," he agreed. "Tomorrow." She looked at him. "Tonight," he said, "I'd like to just sit here for a while." "That's all right." She considered arguing. She had things to plan, numbers to run, a supply order to adjust in light of the new financial structure. All of that was true, and all of it could wait. And she knew it, and he knew she knew it. "Clara asked about you 3 times today," she said. Something in his face softened in the specific way it softened when the children were mentioned. She'd noticed this in him weeks ago and filed it in the place where she kept the things about him that mattered. "What did you tell her?" he said. "That I didn't know when you were coming back." She paused. She accepted that. She's been practicing patience. He smiled. "The real one, not the careful version. She's going to be a formidable person." "She already is," Evelyn said. They sat at the kitchen table while the evening came in around them, and the fire in the stove did its work, and the ranch outside went about its business, and for a little while neither of them reached for the next problem. Vale came to the kitchen the following morning before the crew was up. This had never happened before in the months she'd been at Iron Creek. Vale's mornings were his own. He was always in the yard or the barn by first light, doing the inventory of the day's requirements that he'd been doing for 9 years, and he did not make social calls on the kitchen before sunrise. She heard him at the door and was surprised enough that she turned around before she'd finished the sentence was composing in her head about the supply order. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she'd ever seen from him. "I wanted to tell you something before the day started," he said. She waited. He looked at his hat, then at her. He was a man who'd spent his whole life in physical spaces, barns and pastures, and the open ground of working ranches, and he moved through those spaces with complete authority. Standing in a kitchen, trying to say something personal, had stripped him of his usual sureness. "When you first came," he said, "when you walked through that gate with your children and I—" He stopped. "I treated you poorly. From the beginning. I looked at you and decided what you were before you'd done anything except show up." Kept her expression still, not closed. She wasn't trying to make this harder than it was, but she wasn't going to rush him through it or smooth it over with easy words. "And then every time you did something that proved me wrong," he continued, "I found a new way to be against you. Because being wrong felt worse than—" He stopped again. "It doesn't matter what it felt like. The point is that I made your first weeks here harder than they needed to be. And everything you built here, you built with me pushing against it. And you built it anyway." The kitchen was quiet. "I know why you did it," she said. "I told you that at the beginning. I understood it then. I understand it now." "Understanding why doesn't make it right," he said. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." He turned his hat in his hands one full rotation. "Bank officer," he said. "When he asked about management, I said what I said because it was accurate. Not because I wasn't doing you a favor. I was telling the truth about what I'd seen." She looked at him. "That might be the most significant thing you've done," she said quietly. He frowned slightly. "Telling the truth? For you specifically in that moment?" She paused, choosing the words with care. "Yes," he stood with that for a second. Then he nodded, a single small deliberate nod. "Cross is a good man," he said. "He deserves the thing that's happening." He looked at her. "You both do." He put his hat on and left. She stood in the kitchen alone and felt the particular quality of something that has been misaligned for a long time finally settling into its correct position. Not perfect. Not without the history of the misalignment still present in it. Settled. She turned back to the stove. Spring drive happened in the 5th month. Thomas rode flank, as Cross had promised, and came home 3 days later sunburned and saddle-sore and unable to stop talking about it for a week. He'd made an error on the second day gotten, turned around in a canyon section, and caused a brief confusion among the cattle that Sawyer had needed to correct, and he reported this failure with the same precision he applied to everything, making sure his mother understood exactly what had gone wrong and what he'd learned from it. Pete says everyone makes that mistake the first time, he said. Pete's right, Evelyn said. He also said I'm a natural with the flank work once I stopped overthinking it. Pete doesn't say things to be kind, Evelyn said. Thomas smiled. It was his father's smile, the one that arrived slow and stayed. That's what I told you, he said. The drive numbers came in on the right side of the projection. Not dramatically, not enough to make anyone comfortable, but solidly within the range she'd documented in the bank reports. When she updated the financial accounting to reflect the drive revenue, the numbers told a story she could look at steadily without the low-grade anxiety that had underlain every calculation for 5 months. Not resolved, not finished, but moving in the right direction with enough momentum that the movement felt real. She sent the updated figures to the bank with a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs long and said, in plain language, that Iron Creek Ranch was on track. The bank's response came back in 8 days, noted, and thank you. She filed it with the other correspondents. The wedding happened on a Saturday in late spring, when the ground had thawed and the ranch was in the particular beautiful chaos of a season, fully underway cattle in the pasture. The kitchen garden Evelyn had started in a patch of ground, behind the kitchen, putting out its first green, the yard busy, in a way that felt like abundance rather than urgency. She had not wanted a large ceremony. Cross had not wanted one either, which had been one of many moments where she'd discovered their instincts ran parallel in ways that continued to be surprising and settling in equal measure. They had the judge from Black Hollow, a man named Ferris who had a dry humor and an efficient approach to legal proceedings that she respected, and they had the crew, and they had Ruth Henderson, who had driven 7 miles with Edgar because Evelyn had written asking her, and Ruth Henderson was not a woman who ignored a direct request. Isabel Delacroix had come with her father, who had mellowed somewhat toward Evelyn over the months of correspondence and trade arrangements, and was now capable of addressing her by name rather than by title, which she took as significant progress. Margaret had demanded to stand beside her mother during the ceremony, which was not a traditional arrangement, but which Evelyn had agreed to, because Margaret's logic, "I've been here for all of it, I should be there for this part," was difficult to argue with. Thomas had stood straight and still in a way that made him look 4 years older, which was what he was trying to do and which she let him have. Clara had held a small bunch of the wildflowers she'd collected that morning, with the seriousness of someone who understood the gravity of the occasion, without being entirely clear on its nature. Cross had looked at her during the brief ceremony with the expression she'd stopped trying not to examine, the one that had been there since the early weeks, the one that said something real and meant it. She'd looked back, with whatever was in her own face, and she'd stopped being careful about what that was. After, there was a meal. Of course there was a meal she'd planned it herself, which Vale had told her was ridiculous, that a woman shouldn't cook her own wedding meal, and she'd told him that cooking was not a punishment for her, that she cooked things that mattered when things mattered, and he'd made the sound he made when she'd said something he didn't have a response to. The meal was good. The weather held. Ruth Henderson told stories about her first year on the frontier that made everyone at the table alternately horrified and laughing. Pete read to Thomas from the history book they'd nearly finished. Just a few pages in the corner, both of them pretending it was incidental. Calhoun, who it turned out had a decent singing voice, contributed a song that nobody had asked for but everyone was glad to have. Ferris, leaving at dusk, shook Evelyn's hand with the firm grip of someone making an assessment and said, "That ranch is going to be all right." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You've known that for a while, haven't you?" "Thought about it." "I knew it was possible," she said. "That's different from knowing." He nodded. He seemed to find that satisfactory. He rode back to town. What she understood, in the months after, in the particular way, understanding comes when you've stopped being in the middle of something and can see its shape from a small distance, was that none of it had been about being remarkable. This was the thing that people got wrong about stories like hers, she thought, in the quiet moments when she let herself think about it. They heard the shape of it, woman arrives. Woman succeeds. Woman is vindicated, and they thought it was about exceptional capability or unusual courage, or some particular quality that set her apart from everyone else who'd been in a hard situation and hadn't found a way through. But that wasn't it. That wasn't it at all. What she'd done at Iron Creek wasn't remarkable, just consistent. She'd gotten up every morning and done the thing that needed doing, And then the next morning, she'd gotten up and done the thing that needed doing then. She'd kept doing that until the accumulation of ordinary efforts had built something that looked, from outside, like a transformation. The morning after the wedding, she was up at 4:30. Same as always. Cross came into the kitchen at 5 and found her at the stove and said, "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "This is what I do." He looked at her in the lamplight. He was learning, still. The difference between when she needed something from him and when she needed him to understand that what she was already doing was already right. He was getting better at that distinction, she thought. Slower than she'd like, but genuinely better. "Coffee's ready," she said. He sat down and poured himself a cup and sat in the kitchen while she worked, the same way he'd been sitting in her kitchen for 5 months, and the ordinariness of it was not a letdown. Point. The ordinariness was the thing she'd been building toward all along. Not the drama of survival, not the vindication of being proven right, but the plain dailiness of a life that had room in it for more than getting through. Vale came to her in the 6th month with something that surprised her. He'd been out to the Birch operation again. They'd arranged a second cattle purchase, smaller than the first, and he'd come back with news that wasn't about cattle. "There's a woman," he said, with the pained expression of someone relaying information they weren't sure how to categorize. "Birch's sister-in-law. She's been there since her husband died last winter, helping with the children." Evelyn waited. "She's capable," Vale said, with the effort of a man searching for a word that covered more than he was saying. She looked at him. "Is she?" Evelyn said. He cleared his throat. "I thought you should know." "Since he stopped. Since you seem to have opinions about these matters." "I don't have opinions about your personal life, Gideon." "I know that." He turned his hat in his hands. "I was wondering if another stop, if you might want to come out to the Birch place sometime, to look at the new cattle, the assessment." "The cattle assessment," she said. "And if I happened to meet Birch's sister-in-law during the cattle assessment, that would be incidental," he said. She kept her face serious. "It cost her something." "I think I could arrange a cattle assessment," she said. "Give me a week's notice on the timing." He nodded, put his hat on. At the doorway he stopped, and he looked back at her, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was not the foreman and not the difficult man who had stood in this doorway months ago, with his arms crossed and his certainty that she was the wrong person in the wrong place. Just a man, imperfect, complicated, trying. "You're good for this place," he said, "for all of it." She let that land. "So are you," she said, "when you're not being an obstacle." He made the sound, the not quite law, and left. She went back to the supply accounting she'd been doing before he arrived. And she was smiling before she'd written 3 numbers, and she kept smiling for a while after that. Margaret found the mouth harp. It had been on the side table in the common room. Since the night, Evelyn had stood in the doorway and heard Cross playing, and it had stayed there because neither of them had moved it, and neither of them had talked about why they hadn't moved it. Margaret found it on a Sunday afternoon when she'd been conducting one of her periodic inventories of the house's interesting objects, practice she undertook without permission and reported on afterward, as though the inventory itself constituted authorization. She brought it to the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. "It was his wife's," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He plays it, but not very well." "Not as well as she did," Evelyn said. Margaret turned the harp over in her hands. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness and some third quality that was entirely her own, a particular attentiveness to the emotional weight of objects, of spaces, of silences. She was going to be someone who understood people well, Evelyn thought. It would be useful and occasionally painful, that understanding the way it always was. She'd want him to play it anyway, Margaret said. Evelyn looked at her daughter. "What makes you say that?" "Because she taught him," Margaret said simply. "You teach someone something because you want them to keep doing it, not so they'll stop when you're gone." She set the harp back on the table. "Play it more." Evelyn said nothing. She went back to what she was doing. That evening, without comment, she moved the mouth harp from the side table to the top of the bookshelf in the common room, where it was visible but not in the way, where it could be seen and reached for when someone wanted it. Cross noticed. He didn't say anything about it. But 2 nights later she heard him playing. Not much, just a few minutes, the tentative, unhurried sound of a man doing something for himself rather than for an audience, and she left him to it. The letter from Aldous Crane came one more time in the summer. It was brief, briefer than the first one, and without the elaborate courtesy that had underlain that letter's threat. This one simply said that he'd heard the foreclosure proceedings had been withdrawn, and that he wished the ranch continued success, and that if there was ever an interest in discussing land arrangements of any kind, he remained available. She read it at the kitchen table with Clara on her lap, watching a fly walk across the window glass. She folded the letter. She put it in the stove. She watched it catch and burn and go to nothing, which took less time than she expected, and then she got up and started the afternoon meal. The kitchen garden yielded its first real harvest in late summer. Tomatoes, some squash, a row of beans that had been ambitious to plant and had, against her private doubt, actually come through. Clara had appointed herself head of the bean operation at some point in the spring and had taken to coming out every morning to measure the plant's progress with a stick she'd notched for the purpose, reporting the measurements to anyone who would listen. Evelyn made the first jar of preserved tomatoes from that garden on a Wednesday morning in August, standing at the stove with the summer heat already heavy in the kitchen, and she thought about Ruth Henderson's root cellar and the Henderson arrangement that had been the first real turning point, and about how one thing becomes nothing, becomes another, how the chain of it works, how you can't always see which action was the one that mattered, because they all mattered, and none of them mattered alone. Cross came through the kitchen and stopped when he smelled the tomatoes. "From the garden?" he said. "Clara's beans are next," she said. "She's been documenting the exact day each plant reaches harvesting size. I'll hear about it for weeks." He looked at the jars lined up on the counter. "My wife tried to start a kitchen garden," he said. "First year we were here. The soil defeated her. She kept working. I amended it. I know. I watched you do it in March." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you." She looked up. He said it simply, the way he said true things, without performance, without wanting anything from it. Just a fact he'd been thinking about and had decided to say. "I think I would have liked her," Evelyn said. He nodded. He got his coffee and went back to his day. She stood at the stove and thought about the women who'd come before her in this kitchen, the cook who'd quit 2 weeks before she arrived, and the one before that, and Cross's wife who'd kept this place what it was and whose absence had been in these walls like a watermark since Evelyn walked in. She didn't feel like she'd replaced any of them. She felt like she'd built something alongside the history they'd left behind, the way you build onto an existing structure, using what's there, working with what was already standing, making something new that couldn't have existed without the old. That was what she'd always done, she thought. It was what her mother had done, and her mother before that. You take what's there, you add what you have, you make it work. Pete finished the history book with Thomas on a Friday evening in September, the last pages read aloud in the kitchen corner the same way they'd been reading it for months, both of them at the table with the book between them. When Pete read the last sentence, there was a silence. While Pete said, "Well," Thomas agreed. Pete looked at the closed book. He turned it over in his hands. It was Thomas's book, Daniel Hartwell's boy's copy of a history of the American West that had been carried 12 miles on the day they arrived, and he set it on the table. "Good book," he said. "It is," Thomas said. "There's a second volume," Thomas said. "In town." Driscoll said he saw it at the general store. Pete considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a genuine commitment. "I expect we'll have to get it then." Thomas smiled the slow smile. "I expect we will." Evelyn, who had been listening from the stove, kept her back to them and did not say anything. She was not going to make a moment out of it by observing it. She just let it be what it was, an old man and a boy in a book, and the particular unspectacular beauty of two people finding they needed each other's company. In the fall, when the accounts were settled for the quarter, and the numbers were where they needed to be, and the monthly report to the bank went out with the same early timing she'd established from the first, Evelyn sat down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening and did something she almost never did. She wrote a letter that wasn't about business. She wrote to her mother's sister in Kansas, a woman she hadn't been in contact with in 2 years, since the farm failed, and the shame of failure had made Evelyn go quiet toward people who'd known her when things were different. She wrote honestly. She said what had happened, all of it, from the notice on the post outside the general store, to the walk across frozen ground to the gate of Iron Creek Ranch. She said what it had been. She said where it had led. She said, "I wanted you to know I am all right. I am more than all right." She sealed the letter and left it for Pete to take to town. Then she went to the common room where Cross was sitting by the fireplace with the mouth harp on the side table and the evening quiet around him, and she sat in the chair across from him, and the fire made its sound, and she did not reach for the next problem. There was a version of herself she thought about sometimes, the woman who had stood at that gate on a frozen morning and been laughed at, who'd watched her daughter's hand go still, who'd felt the specific weight of being looked at and found insufficient before she'd done anything except show up. That woman had not known what was on the other side of the gate. She'd only known that walking away was the one thing she couldn't do. She thought about her, tired and stubborn, and carrying everything on nothing but will, and the stubborn arithmetic of one more day. She had never needed anyone to see her as exceptional. She hadn't walked 12 miles in the cold because she was brave. She'd walked 12 miles because it was what the situation required, and she was the person in the situation. She'd rebuilt the kitchen because it needed rebuilding, and she was there. She'd fixed the financial structure because the numbers were wrong, and she could see how to make them right. She'd stayed when everything told her to go because her youngest daughter's hand had gone still in hers, and she could not let that be the last thing. None of it was heroic. All of it was just work. The kind of work that doesn't look like anything from outside because it looks like cooking, like letter writing, like math done on a kitchen table late at night. The kind of work that women have been doing in difficult circumstances since before anyone thought to write it down, building something out of what's available, feeding people who need feeding, holding the center when the center wants to come apart. The only thing exceptional about it was that she hadn't stopped, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the whole of it, not some rare quality that separated her from everyone else in a hard situation, but simply the decision, made fresh every morning, to get up and do the thing that needed doing. Maybe the distance between surviving and building something worth surviving for was only ever that small and that hard. One more day, and then the day after that, and then the one after that, until you looked up and realized the worst of it was behind you, and you were still standing. She looked at the man across from her, tired, honest, trying, imperfect in all the specific ways that made him real rather than a story, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not happiness exactly. Something more durable than happiness. A kind of settled rightness that didn't require anything more from her than what she already was. Cross picked up the mouth harp from the side table. He held it for a moment. Then he played halting, unpracticed, the sound of someone doing something they love without being particularly good at it. A few bars of something she didn't recognize, and then a few bars of something she almost did. She didn't say anything. She sat in the warmth of the fire in the kitchen she'd made into the center of something. In the ranch she'd helped pull back from the edge. In the life she hadn't planned and hadn't expected, and had built anyway out of a worn coat and a job notice, and the refusal to accept that showing up was insufficient. Outside the window, Iron Creek Ranch went about its evening. Cattle were settled. The crew was quiet. The kitchen garden, finished now with the season, would start again in spring. Everything that needed doing had been done. Everything that needed building was standing. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the imperfect music, and she let herself have the night.